We have already done 2 of these panels. The first one, again, the highest priority when it came to our members was electoral reform. So we did a panel on electoral reform. Last month's panel was on healthcare, and this month's panel is on economic justice. And so just as a quick background to put us all on the same page, I'm just going to read out what you all said, or what the members who chimed in said when it came to what our goals are in the area of economic justice. All right. So the first thing that folks said was that there is a universal living wage that can sufficiently meet individual needs and that promotes basic dignity. That it prioritizes marginalized, vulnerable individuals and ensures an adequate safety net. That there's equal access to opportunity and advantages, including things like technology and information. That there is easy access to quality education that teaches relevant skills. It was relevant to the economic system and the economic market, right? It ensures sufficient affordable housing and community safety. Prevents outsized economic influence. Eliminates workplace discrimination. And that policy and programs promote financial literacy, access, and financial protection. So those are the goals that kind of are our light post at the end of the tunnel, right? To move our work forward. And so what we're going to talk about are some solutions that might enable us to get there. How do those goals sound? Good stuff. Would we be happy if we achieve those? I think so. Okay. Great. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce our panel, and then going to give them some time just to discuss, 2-3 minutes to discuss what are the 2 to 3 policy areas that they think we should be thinking about most to move the ball in these areas, and then we'll enter into a discussion first between the panel and I, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And so I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we have Luis Martinez. Everyone say hi, Luis. Luis is the Diversity and Inclusion Lead for San Diego Startup Week, and is also an advocate for entrepreneurship. And then we have Stephen Russell. Everyone say hi, Stephen Russell. Hi, you said the last name too. That's great. Executive Director of San Diego Housing Federation. Next, we have Parisa Ujadi Magsudi, who is a poverty attorney and writer, and also teaches law at USD, is the Assistant Director of Public Service. Let's say hi, Parisa. Next, we have Dave Lagstein, who is the SEIU Local 221 Political Director. Hi, Dave. And lastly, we have Peter Brownell, who is the Research Director at the Center on Policy Initiatives. Hi, Peter. All right, excellent. And so, Stephen, I'm going to actually start with you. And what I'd like to know are, what are 2 to 3 of the top policy solutions that you think can help move us in a direction to achieve these goals?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Hold that a little bit away here. There's a lot of things we could be doing. The ones I'm going to focus on are where I think I can speak most credibly. One is with regards to providing a safety net. We need to provide more local revenue for affordable housing, because with the death of redevelopment, we have lost about $100 million a year that we used to have in this region to build the kind of housing that low-wage working families, seniors, veterans, folks with disabilities, and the recently homeless rely on for those homes to be produced. So I think there's something we should be doing there. We've been promoting a bond measure. It'll be at the Rules Committee on the 16th of this month that would be specifically for that purpose. I encourage you to tune into that conversation. At the same time, if we're successful in building what we think we can do with this measure, 2,500 permanent supportive housing units, that's everybody who's sleeping on the streets who is eligible for permanent supportive housing, we need $30 million a year in revenue just for the services. And the county surplus is just sitting there. They are not spending the money that they should be spending at the county on basic services that is their charge as a county to provide health and human services for this region. And so people are being left to sleep on the streets. The city is scrambling together and poaching from its permanent housing money to pay for temporary solutions because the county isn't there. So I think we should be acting on the county to make them release some of the surplus for the purposes that is collected. Access to opportunity, obviously we want to invest in robust public transit. And I've worked with the City Heights CDC in the past on getting passes for low-income residents, in particular students, to give them access to the region, which is economic access, it's educational access. And of course, building on the lands that MTS has that are underutilized. There's a lot of parking lots near transit stations we could be building housing on. And as far as affordable housing goes, I think I'll circle back. Inclusionary housing is important. Right now, we've produced over the last decade, if you look at the thirds of income brackets, the top third, we've produced about 130% of the housing that is needed by that income sector locally. It's a lot of people coming in, bringing money from outside, either as investments, second homes, ways of hiding their capital from abroad. A lot of the upper end market is frankly not for people who live here. And in fact, we also know that 5% of the housing, the rental stock, is off market due to second homes, vacation rentals, short-term vacation rentals, et cetera. And so addressing the Airbnb issue is actually pretty significant, because that 5% margin of vacancy is the difference between a market where a tenant has no bargaining power. We think a 5% vacancy rate is healthy. Tenants and landlords have equal bargaining power. When it goes below 5%, tenants are at a disadvantage negotiating for rent, and above 5%, landlords are making concessions to get renters. You take 5% of the rental market off the market, you've immediately disadvantaged every single renter in the county when it comes to their negotiating their rent. So I think we need to do something about that.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Parisa.
Okay, can you all hear me? Excellent. Hi, everybody. My name is Parisa Ijedi Maksudi. For the last 8 years, I've worked on cases for low-income individuals as a poverty attorney. So I started under Obama's stimulus grant, working on homeless prevention and outreach and eviction defense in a very rural area. And that was Northern California. What I'm seeing down here in San Diego is worse than up there. Despite the funding, despite the media, despite a lot of individuals who are elected who we think are progressive. So there's a couple things that we can really do to achieve the goals that you've laid out, the economic justice goals. There's two main ones I'm going to talk about in my 3 minutes. The first one is desegregation. So the Obama administration identified San Diego region as one of only 23 regions in the entire country for being so segregated. So one of only 23. And the Obama administration directed San Diego County and San Diego region to desegregate its Section 8 housing because the segregation levels were adversely impacting low-income people of color and families of color. So this segregation has an adverse effect on families, on children, and especially on access to quality education. So I know one of the goals you've laid out is education and access. A vital way for us locally to achieve access is by implementing an Obama-era desegregation rule that the San Diego Housing Commission has actually considered putting into effect. So there's a lot of litigation around this one rule, but long story short, all 22 of the 23 regions were forced to desegregate based on court order from last December. San Diego, however, doesn't have to, because the city of San Diego has opted out of following federal law, so federal protections aimed at protecting tenants. So through something called moving to work, which sounds great, right? It'd be great if we could move to work. So one thing that the San Diego Housing Commission is considering right now is encouraging the implementation of this rule. So what this rule will do, real quick, 30 seconds, is it'll increase rents for all low-income voucher holders so that they can move into high-opportunity, low-poverty areas. It's a very easy switch. There's funding there to do it, and the administrative burden is very low. So I'm happy to talk more about that later. But in my last minute, I would like to talk about economic justice when it comes to income. So there's 3 income welfare benefits that we can receive if we're low income. The first one is SSI, Supplemental Security Income. That means if you're elderly or unable to work and have no Social Security record, so you haven't paid into a system to give you your Social Security benefits, you get an amount to live off of for the rest of your life. That amount is $715, which is 90% of the federal poverty level. So when we talk about people getting Social Security who are disabled, that's what they're living on every month. In San Diego, that often means you're homeless. It's a very easy fix. The California legislature can increase this number, and they have a reserve fund to do it. Back in 2009, this number was high enough so that you were above the federal poverty level. It's not currently. if you get this benefit of $915 a month, you're not eligible for food stamps. You're not eligible for other basic safety nets. It's incredibly disturbing. The second one will be even quicker, and that's food stamps. You all have heard about the Farm Bill in effect right now, or being considered right now. So the Farm Bill just passed the committee last Wednesday, and it's going to be before the House very soon. We all can advocate against the Farm Bill, and the reason for that, it's going to affect anyone receiving food stamps by requiring them to work, which is absurd, right? If you work, you should not need food stamps. So we're requiring these people to work in minimum wage jobs, even though they have kids, and even though many of them have disabilities. So it's not an effective way to help people out of poverty. And the third one I'll be really quick about is general relief, which is if you're homeless and you're not eligible for Social Security because you don't have a disability, you can receive $337 a month from the county. Unfortunately, the county welfare office is telling people that if you get this amount, you're gonna owe us. This is a loan, you're gonna have to pay it back. So most of my clients would say, well, I don't wanna be obligated, I can't afford to pay that back. I'm not gonna be able to work, I have a disability. What the welfare office isn't telling these individuals is you don't have to pay it back unless you can afford to pay it back, which is very unlikely if you're gonna be living on disability for the rest of your life, or if you're gonna be working in a low wage job. So there's lots of people on the street that we can really help by informing them and having our elected officials make sure the people who are working with these individuals on the streets are telling them the accurate information.
Great. Peter, let's move to you.
These are things that are moving right now. So one is just around affordability of housing, and particularly rent stabilization and rent control measures to sort of stop the sort of speculation and gouging of renters that we've seen in markets like San Diego. So at the local level, we're part of a coalition with ACE, with a number of unions and community groups in National City that are currently collecting signatures for a ballot initiative that would create a rent stabilization and just cause eviction ordinance in National City, which is 68% renters, majority Latino. It's one of so National City is currently the lowest market rents, or the lowest gross rents of any of the incorporated cities in San Diego, but it's also growing very quickly. Between the last two census, ACS, American Community Survey data in 2015 and 2016, the gross rent in National City grew over 15%. So, and you've probably heard experiences like that of people everywhere throughout the county that are getting, asked for outrageous rent increases, and that's what rent stabilization would do. Is it would set a cap on how much rent can be raised from year to year based on the overall rate of inflation, with an overall cap. So that's one thing that's you can currently plug in if you wanted to, in terms of collecting signatures. There's weekend mobilizations, as well as paid signature gatherers that are working on it throughout the week. And then similarly, ACE is also working at the statewide level on the repeal of the Costa-Hawkins Act, which is one of the things that limits us from having stronger rent control measures here in California. So what we're moving in National City, or trying to move there, is rent stabilization. And under current law, it's really limited to the number of units and the age of units that it can be applied to. It would, if nothing changes at the state, even if we win in National City, it'll only be applied to units that were built before 1995. And so the main two things that the repeal of Costa-Hawkins, which is being circulated right now to try and get on the November ballot statewide, that would both expand the ability of rent stabilization or rent control measures to newer housing, and it would also allow strong rent control. Right now we have rent stabilization, or rent stabilization is legal in California, which limits how much a tenant's rent can be raised, but once the market becomes vacant, or once the unit becomes vacant, essentially the price resets and the landlord can get anything that the market will bear for it. And stronger rent control, which Costa-Hawkins repeal would allow cities that wanted to impose stronger rent control, where they impose, a strict, set of how much the rent can go up on a unit, whether it becomes vacant or not. So those are things that are moving right now that I think are really important around the affordable housing realm. There's so much else that we could focus on. What's that?
We'll circle back.
All right.
Dave.
Thank you. I'm Dave Lagseam from SEIU 221, and even though it's a sleepy Sunday, I'm fired up and happy to be here. I want to say, so I represent SEIU members. Mostly we represent county employees, and I think it's important that, you know, in a time where, you know, obviously within the White House, within the Koch brothers, there's a specific attack on unions, and it's the same attack on working people, on people of color, on low-income people. And we think it's important as a union to sort of stand together. They're attacking us all together, and we need to stand together. People think of unions traditionally as fighting for fair contracts for our members, which we certainly do, but part of the work that I'll talk about and the issues is not just about the members of our union or folks within the labor movement, but fighting for working people and low-income people. So with that little bit of background as to why I'm happy to be here, Peter stole one of the issues that it's important to us that we're working on, Costa-Hawkins, around, of course, affordability for housing. Another thing that's coming up, people have heard about basically commercial tax reform for Prop 13. This is now likely to be on the ballot for 2020, and people understand it's known as split roll. So basically corporations, a couple poster children like Disney and Chevron, they're still paying the same taxes that they were 20 or 30 years ago. Peter's my fact checker if I get anything wrong. But the idea is this has a massive impact on our state budget because we don't have revenue, because folks on the commercial side aren't paying their fair share. It's so hard to get Prop 13 reform because people picture you're going to throw grandma out of the house. And so we need to make sure, as we talk about, as we move to the 2020 ballot, to make sure this is about corporations and, you know, large companies paying their fair share. And there's a line between the kind of thing that we talk about for services that go down to townies, and there's also a line between California, I believe it's 42nd or 46th in education funding. That's my younger daughter going into kindergarten, my older one in second grade, and we have class sizes, we have materials. People that have families in school, they understand what that's like, and if we can get this done, it'll make a big difference on our budget, and the budget is our values. Speaking of the budget as our values, Steve, thanks for mentioning that. The County of San Diego really showed us over the last week what their values are when they joined onto the Trump lawsuit. It was despicable, but I can't say that it was surprising. We have 5 supervisors. There have 5 Republican supervisors. 4 of them have been there for 20 years. They have a $2 billion budget, and what that means is they're not spending money on mental health. They're skimping on public health nurses, which contributed to the Hep A crisis. They're worst in terms of food stamps and vital services, which causes poverty in the region. And so, you know, hopefully this was talked about in election reform, but we need to get rid of all these board of supervisors. So we have this petition that SEIU and our coalition has done. It's called the Full Voter Participation. This will require elections to be decided in November. Sign here if you haven't already. Elections will be decided in November when as many as 80% of the people vote, instead of in June when 20% of the people vote. Concretely, right now, unfortunately, we're not going to change this time, but this won't happen again. We have a district attorney race. We have a sheriff's race. We have a assessor's race. These are all going to be decided in June when a lot of people aren't paying attention. People want to come in and they say, I want to have a different vision of what the district attorney's office in November. That election will be decided. If we sign this initiative, get it on the ballot, and vote it in November, we'll have an opportunity basically to turn the Board of Supervisors with term limits. And that is so important because we have the opportunity to elect people that have, you know, that have the values, that are going to do the right thing by the community and with our county resources. And the last thing I want to say, which I hope that we'll get to, I think it's important. We're going to come up with a lot of great ideas in terms of policy change and policy ideas. I think it's always really important to ground it in what's our power analysis, who is the decision maker, and how can we influence those decisions, and what's our theory of change, how are we going to get them to change their mind. I'll be honest, I don't have a plan to change Bill Horn's mind on signing on to the Trump lawsuit, and that's important to know when you make your strategic decisions. It might still be fun to go after him and expose him as the bigot that he is, but that's kind of a different discussion. So really grounding our, you know, whatever the plans are for this group and our coalitions, and what's the theory of change and what's the power of analysis. So I'm excited to be here and hear other ideas and be part of the discussion. Hopefully I didn't use more than my 3 minutes.
Great. Okay, Luis, your turn.
Good afternoon, everyone. How you doing? All right. So I've been involved with the startup community for over 3 years here in San Diego. And one of the main issues that we have is there is a divide between the people of color in San Diego and kind of everyone else when it comes to tech and innovation and the information that is given. And so what I am trying to do is actually get everyone together, because for some reason, there seems to be a serious divide, and even with information. So I'll give you a perfect example. There are programs here that are based in Southeast San Diego that do not get the funding. And so you may have the same program that may be in La Jolla or, Claremont and those type of areas, and they get the same funding or even funding at all. Like, you know what I mean? So my job is to kind of make sure that we get equal opportunities to those funding as well. Currently, I have 2 startups. So one is in particular is called Melon Mentor. So I actually plan to bring minority authors to the social media, face to the internet. And so I would love to have a positive depiction of people of color out there in the streets doing their thing, convincing younger people that it's okay to read a book, it's okay to be a doctor or a lawyer, and everyone doesn't have to be a basketball player or some type of entertainer. And so another thing is easy access to quality education. So I'm actually in the middle of putting up a proposal to kind of reform the welfare system. I would like to actually implement a entrepreneurial system to where we can give those people a sense of empowerment instead of dependency on government sources. So that's about it. So
Great. Thank you so much.
All right.
Is this working? Yeah, great. Thank you. So, Stephen, let's come back to you. You talked about the county surplus that came up again, and you said that rather than temporary solutions, we might want to think about investing in other kind of human services. When it comes to, again, the goals that our members laid out, what kind of services would be the high priority when it comes to the use of that surplus, in your mind?
Well, it starts with when people pay too much in rent, they start making choices. If they pay more than 30% of their income for their housing, then you start making trade-offs between food, medicine, rent, and a whole host of other things. And so I think if we can make sure that no family is food insecure, that's a fundamental thing. That means at the end of the month, if they have enough food, they can more likely have enough rent. So that's absolutely critical. Obviously, the medical care, we are seeing a lot of the folks who are on the streets can cost thousands of dollars for a single ambulance ride to the emergency room. And that same amount of money could house them for 2 or 3 months if we were using it more effectively. We're housing people temporarily in tents. It costs a family of 4, it's costing us $5,000 a month to keep a family of 4 in a tent. And so when you look at that city money we're using right now, the county should be providing services, we should be helping folks find the apartments they need. And once they have them, one of the things that's really critical is someone who's been homeless. When we talk about permanent supportive housing, I don't know how many people know the term. It's really affordable housing for folks who are recently homeless, permanent supportive housing. And to qualify, you have to have been chronically homeless or have other physical or mental conditions that confound your condition, make it hard for you to stay housed. And once you're housed, if you take a homeless person who's been long-term homeless and put them in an apartment with no services, fewer than half are going to stay there in a year. If you give them services, someone who knocks on their door every day, checks their nutrition status, maybe their medication status, maybe just a little social interaction, 90% will stay housed after a year. And so those kinds of services for permanent supportive housing are critical. And as we begin to try to draw down state level resources to build, we need the local service dollars. And so the county should be allocating aggressively the monies we know that we're going to need in future years to match up the capital dollars to build housing with the services that keep people stabilized and thriving in those settings. So food and services.
Supportive services in connection with housing. Any other ideas on uses that you think are high priority? This is for the rest of the panel, because I know it came up.
Well, I want to chime in just real quick on the 30%. So if you're paying more than 30% of your rent, of your income towards rent, you are rent burdened. That's a national standard, evidence-based, really well accepted, right? So what does San Diego Housing Commission make people pay? They encourage people to pay up to 50% of their income towards rent to move into high opportunity areas. It's not right. It's really not right. And again, it's because the city has opted out of following federal law. And so what I've seen with that issue is people move into these high opportunity areas, better schools, because there's more funding for the schools there, which is a problem in and of itself. and then they miss one rent payment because their kid had a medical bill and insurance hasn't covered it yet, or their car broke down, and then they're evicted. If you get evicted from having a subsidy, a housing subsidy, there's a 10-year wait list to get the housing subsidy. If you get evicted, you not only are homeless or potentially homeless, you have an eviction on your record, make it harder for you to get housed again, and you lose your subsidy. You're back to the 10 years. So we can do local changes to get in line with federal models, which would really help out a lot of the tenants.
Great. Yeah, go for it.
I think this is an important issue because it's pretty complex, but when you look at Section 8, it used to be that Section 8 was a single number, and what the government would do is pay the difference between the 30% you can afford and the market rent. Well, the market was San Diego County, which is crazy because, renting in Lemon Grove is not the same as renting, say, in I don't even know the names, Carmel Valley, or places where the schools are really exceptional. What the government basically says is that you use small market rents to set the basis, so that if you're renting in Lemon Grove, the ceiling that they're going to pay is lower. If you're renting up in North County, the ceiling that they're willing to pay, the feds will pay, is higher, so that you can actually afford a poor family to live in these nice neighborhoods. What the commission has adopted is something in between. It is neither nor, where there's 3 categories, so low, medium, and high, and it doesn't really capture what the market is for these families. And just to be clear, Section 8, landlords love it in a down market, right? Because even though the market may be like this, the government's going to pay them up to the so-called market, which is higher than they can actually get normally. They love Section 8 during a down market. During a rising market, they don't love it so much because they can pretty much get the market rent from folks, and they don't have to go through paperwork, and they don't have to deal with the stigma. So you see signs, and it's shocking. It's almost like, colored and white fountains. You see no Section 8 on a sign. I find that reprehensible, okay, that they're just out and out doing discrimination. So there is also source of income discrimination legislation that's moving, and that's something to be monitoring, is basically saying we want to forbid discriminating against people because of the source of their income. If they show they are capable of paying the rent, and that voucher sure as heck says so, you shouldn't be able to use that as a consideration in discriminating against them. So there's a whole set of issues unpacked around that, and I just wanted to make sure that we...
Peter wanted to chime in.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring us back to the issue that Stephen raised around food and food stamps, and other folks have mentioned it here. I mean, that's another place where the county could be doing a lot more. The bottom line is, and so we've done a report on this in terms of looking at the percentage of households that are eligible that the county is succeeding in enrolling in. And basically the bottom line is, they're doing a poor job. They're behind other major or large counties. And what that means is that we're not only like leaving families and kids hungry, but we're also leaving state and federal dollars on the table, because the benefits for those programs, for CalFresh here, those benefits, the dollars that people get to buy food, those are all paid by mostly the federal and then the state government. And so, the county could be putting up more money in terms of making sure that it's outreaching and sort of overcoming the barriers to folks enrolling in those programs, put more money on the table for local families, pull more money into our local economy for our stores, right? So that's one piece. And I think like one of the things that the county will say is a problem is stigma. Like that people don't want to enroll in these programs. People want to be independent. And the county has a role in that too, because our county is the only county in the country in terms of public benefits that not for CalFresh, for food stamps, but for TANF, for CalWorks, which is cash aid, that it requires home visits, inspections of 100% of people, whether there's any suspicion of fraud or not, but it requires home inspections of 100% of people before they can get those benefits. So I think like that sort of speaks to the role that the county has in sort of assuming that people are lying, assuming that like sort of creating that stigma that sort of says that you're not really entitled to these benefits, right? So and that's an area where like right now in terms of public employees, we've got a number of people at the DA's office who are involved in sort of pursuing fraud there that could be redeployed to pursue other issues, and our ask is that we end that program, which is Project 100 for 100%, and move those people in the DA's office to pursue wage theft, right? So to pursue cases where people aren't getting paid what they're legally owed.
Great. Luis, you wanted to say something?
Yes. So I would like to bring a little bit of perspective into this conversation. I kind of want to elaborate on what you were talking about with the food stamps and the welfare. I do a lot of work with the African American community and the Latino community. And so one thing that a lot of people don't understand is the psychology of why, there are several people on welfare and generations. So one thing that I like to talk about is the generational pass down as far as like welfare is really, really, really problematic. And so what people have to understand is when you have people that are in despair, a lot of times they don't know any better. So you're gonna have grandmother was on food stamps in Section 8, then the mother is on Section 8, and then the daughter, and then her daughter eventually. The purpose of welfare, obviously, as everyone knows, is that, hey, government, I'm in a jam. I need you to help me out for a little while, and then until I get back on my feet, get a job, and then get off of it. Well, there's a lot of people that are so dependent on those government systems. And so that's why I talk about entrepreneurship and empowerment, so we can actually get those people off of that and actually build the economy. And so it's kind of a win-win for everyone. So just food for thought.
Great. And I do want to pivot to this idea of kind of support into jobs or entrepreneurship a little bit down the line. I do want to piggyback on this idea of how to use the county surplus and talk a little bit more about revenue again with the repeal of Prop 13. And so, Dave, will you tell us a little bit more? You said we should expect it in 2020. What is the aim of it? What is it going to do? What is the purpose of what it's going to do? Can you share a little bit about what the goal is there?
Yes, so there's a broad coalition of many organizations. I won't name them because I'll get it wrong. It's a statewide coalition. But again, the idea is there are signatures currently being signed. I think the campaign is close to the end. So if you haven't signed it, make sure you do so. And the notion is to put it on the 2020 ballot. And basically the idea is this would be an increase in state funding. And of course, like when we're dealing with commercial property tax reassessment across the board, that's going to be a significant amount of money. There is a projection. I don't know what it is. Peter, do you know it off the top of your head? I don't know it off the top of my head. But it's pretty massive. And I think the idea is when you look at state funding, some of that money does flow down to county for county services. Some of that money, those are probably the two biggest flows of money when we increase the state revenue. It flows down to county for county services for the things that we're talking about, whether it be mental health, whether it be vital services, et cetera. And of course, the money for schools. Those are probably the two biggest flows of money. And of course, when we have more revenues, then we have more options. The option that you talked about increasing, increasing, which policy was it? I forget. It was increasing the amount that you said that the state legislators could work on.
The SSI?
Yeah. Oh, for SSI. It really is Sunday. I forgot. I think that's the kind of thing where without making excuses, when we have, even in a good economy, we have a relatively limited budget, there's choices, we increase the pie in terms of revenue, then those choices are easier for legislators to make. And so that's why it's so important, and that's why we should also be ready for all of us in terms of there's going to be a really powerful pushback because people think about Prop 13 on the home ownership side for individual property, and that won't be impacted. There is a really positive aspect where that prevents, with sort of ballooning housing costs, it prevents the property taxes from going up. This doesn't touch the property taxes. It's just on the commercial side. It's a huge impact to the state, and people are basically going to lie and distort it in 2020, so each of us has a responsibility to be ready. So hopefully that's helpful, and if anyone else has to add,
Peter, you wanted to say something, and then Stephen.
He's my fact checker. Yeah. So just one reference. First of all, like if people are interested in looking and understanding the history of Prop 13 better, Isaac Martin, who's the chair of the sociology department at UCSD, it's what he's got. He's got a book about it. He's got a couple of books around tax issues, but specifically around the history of Prop 13. And I think there's two things to think about in terms of Prop 13 and what split rolls or make it fair can do. One is just the incredible sort of shortcoming, like everything good that we want to do, whether it's education, whether it's whether it's providing libraries and providing food stamps and providing, any of these kind of benefits, and also, making sure that we're, providing good employment opportunities, because the public sector has been historically, a source of solid jobs that provide retirement, that provide benefits that families can live on, that can provide the kind of living wage that we're talking about here, and that are much more accessible and have done a much better job in terms of being open and accessible to communities of color and to women. So like public employment is an area where it's critically important, not only because of the service side that it provides, but because of the job opportunities and the high quality jobs that it's historically provided, which the budget shortfalls have been used as a motivation for chipping away at that. And if you look at what we've done with pensions in the city of San Diego, that's an example of that. So on the revenue side, critically important, but just in terms of the equity side, what people may not understand and why split rolls is targeted at basically bringing commercial properties out from under the Prop 13 umbrella is that commercial properties almost never change hands, and that's how a property's assessment gets reset to the market value, is when the property changes hands. So residential properties change hands. I mean, people buy and sell houses. I don't know the figure off the top of my head, but it's like, the average person owns their house for about 8 years before they sell it, right? So and then the property assessment and the taxes get reset to whatever it sells for on the market. Commercial properties downtown, the really expensive properties, right? They don't change hands. They're, like even if it's, Acme company that owns it, the property is actually probably owned by the 123 Market Street Corporation, and then Acme owns, controls that corporation. So, and unless 50% or more of Acme changes hands, then that downtown, skyscraper that is worth, millions of dollars is still being taxed at 1978 rates. So that's critically important in terms of an equity issue. Not only are we starving all the kinds of public services and all the things that are so critical for our communities, but we're actually taking the burden off of corporations and placing it much more on homeowners and through their rents on renters who are, they're the ones that at the end of the day are providing the revenue that goes to pay those taxes for landlords as well. So it's an equity issue as well as a funding issue.
Okay, Stephen, last thought on this one, and then I'm going to transition to new topic.
Yeah, and Peter actually gave that great explanation, which I thought was important, is why is the split roll significant? I would say that those benefits of the tax protections flow back mostly to shareholders of corporations, and so a lot of that is money we're subsidizing. These are tax dollars now that are being saved by people who are living, where the shareholders live, which is typically concentrated in the Northeast, not in California. The same is true, though, of the housing market increasingly. Last year, 40% of single-family home transactions, all home transactions, 40% were all cash, which means either they're high net worth individuals or investors. And so you're seeing increasingly the housing stock right after the recession was bought up by a lot of real estate investment trusts or REITs, which are going to continue to farm us for rents in perpetuity. And that's where rent control becomes a more significant issue. Is if it was local landlords, and they always put the local mom and pop operators out in front when we have rent stabilization discussions, but the largest landlords are large corporations that count on speculating on growth in rent so they can turn over these units and sell them at higher prices. And it drives itself, the lack of rent stabilization fuels a market. So there's so many ways to talk about rent control, and I think that's something we as a region need to talk about, but it's important to understand the underlying dynamics of our region being continually robbed of our resources. We are almost a feudal economy here in a lot of ways, folks.
So Parisa, I wanted to move to something that you had said about food stamps. So this requirement of work, right? And I wanted to link it to something that I think Peter was bringing up about stigma, or one of the panelists brought about stigma. This idea that people who are getting food stamps aren't trying to work, right? And so I want you to speak a little bit about, because Luis also brought up this idea that, folks don't want to just get handouts, as it was termed, right? They want to be in the workforce. And one of the top goals is that people are earning a universal living wage, right? And so can you help us understand what the challenge is with requiring work with food stamps, right? Why do we not want to see that when we do actually want to see them hopefully move to work at some point in time? And what else can we do when it comes to services? Because we've talked a lot about supportive services. what are the services that might help us get to folks not needing food stamps? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So let me give you a little bit of data about what happens when people have food stamps in the arena of working. So actually, let me back up a sec. So the Farm Bill, we're all familiar with the Farm Bill, right? So the Farm Bill, what it's going to do is it's going to implement what were pilot work requirement programs for certain individuals receiving food stamps. And we call it CalFresh in California. And those work pilot programs, they were put into effect to see what would happen, whether there would be a good outcome or a bad outcome if we mandated work as a condition of receiving food stamps. So instead of waiting until the evidence from those programs came through, which it hasn't, Congress is deciding to move ahead with this program. So I just want to let you all know this is not an evidence-based idea, which is really concerning, given the fact that most programs that are implemented by the federal government are evidence-based. So there's work pilot programs going on, and there's no evidence yet. So currently, for individuals receiving food stamps, over 50% of them who can work, who haven't quite received disability yet, which doesn't mean they're disabled, 50% of them are working. And that's even higher, it's 60% if you are in a household with kids. So this misconception that everyone who's receiving food stamps who can work are not working is just, it's not true. So the underlying premise for Congress's position to require work is not, is flawed. So that being said, for those who are receiving food stamps, 80% of them worked in the past year or will be working in the year after they terminate food stamps. So food stamps really are a vital safety net for individuals who are not employed, often because they're in between jobs or they're on disability or they're not able to work for whatever reason. So with the Farm Bill, what they're proposing isn't just working, that you have to work to get food stamps, which is nuts if you think about it. You have to work to be eligible for food stamps. If you're working, you shouldn't be eligible for food stamps.
Meaning you should make enough that you could buy your own
right?
food.
Yeah. So we're subsidizing corporations. So that's something that I think is a little bit farther for us to get towards. So if this Farm Bill goes through, what it does on the ground for the people I will represent, for people receiving food stamps, it means they're reporting every single month the amount of work that they're doing. So not only is that incredibly burdensome for an individual who is dealing with disability or is unemployed and looking for work, our welfare offices cannot sustain that. I mean, I've had cases where the welfare office lost the notice that my client turned in saying that she was verifying that there's another child in her home. She's taking care of her grandkid. She turned that in, and she told me she turned it in. I know she turned it in. The welfare lost it, so we lost the case because it's our word against the welfare office. The welfare offices are understaffed. They don't receive enough training. They're underpaid. And so now you're asking them to mandate processing of monthly reports to show people are working. People are automatically going to not receive benefits because the welfare office will make administrative mistakes. They're human. Moreover, people are sanctioned. If I make a mistake and under this bill, I don't report correctly the amount that I worked, I'm sanctioned for a month, which means for a year, I don't get food stamps. My kids don't get food stamps. If I make a mistake in 2 months in a row, let's say I'm a limited English proficient and I don't receive the document in my language. If I make a mistake for 2 months in a row, 3 years, I'm ineligible for food stamps. I mean, this is absolutely, it's mean. That's really what it is. It's really hurting those that can benefit the most from food stamps. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. So, Luis, I want to now turn to you. So we've talked about revenue, and there are different sources of revenue that we've talked about that could be brought in, right? And we've talked about some of the services, so food stamps or anything that makes sure that people are food secure, housing, mental health, and whatnot. So different supportive services. Now, I know that you also want to see those revenues move toward programs that help people during this time to get back on their feet and potentially also start companies.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what you have in mind.
Well, what I have in mind is more of teaching those people about entrepreneurship. So just kind of a real basic introduction. I'm not going to categorize like that, but a lot of people just don't want to be on welfare. Like, let's just keep it real. Like, I'm a first generation immigrant. So my family's from Honduras. And for my father to like come home and be like, hey, we're on welfare was like sort of like embarrassment, And so my father believed in hard work and, any means necessary. So when we first got here and, we lived in Brooklyn, New York City, and we lived in the projects and we saw how, like I was referring before, just generations of people just being on welfare and not understanding, well, why don't they just get off of welfare and go find a real job? And just being dismissive and lazy and not understanding the psychology part of it. And so what he was alluding to is what I recommend is teaching about entrepreneurship as far as like having some sense of your own, building something that, you as a man or a woman could be proud of to pass on to your kids and kind of get the ball rolling as far as like the economy and building own businesses and giving back to the community. I hear people in our community always complaining about, well, our community is getting gentrified and, there are outsiders that are coming in and building all these nice buildings, but they're only doing it is because they're trying to, attract the hipsters. And it's like, well, no, we have to come to the table with our own. It's kind of like with anything else. We wouldn't be on this panel if we didn't have something to give. We would just be a bunch of people just talking. So we have to come to the table with something of our own. And then when we come to the table, then we can be respected. And now once we're respected, people actually hear what we have to say and actually move the ball going forward with entrepreneurship. So I think that's one of the main solutions that we can have as far as like reforming the welfare system, because I think it's crazy that you were talking about you have to actually work to get food stamps. That's ridiculous. So
great. Yes, Stephen, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience.
Yes, so another one of the services the county could invest in is childcare, because one of the challenges, one of the biggest hurdles, especially for women in the workforce, is having quality, reliable childcare, because a woman as an employee, a mother as an employee, is only as reliable as her childcare, and she can be completely undercut by that. Wages are low in that sector, and so that's part of the problem. There isn't enough of it because wages are low and there's inconsistency. So there's a whole series of things that could be done around childcare that could help the situation as well.
Great. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. What questions do you all have? Yes.
I have a question. We've got a microphone right over here. Over by the window.
Oh, great.
Okay, just a quick question about welfare. Is there a limit as to how many years somebody can collect welfare?
Oh, yeah. Very much so.
So there's limits for all types of welfare. And for the welfare, for what we consider welfare, I don't consider welfare. You pay into the system, it's there in case you have disability. For some welfare benefits, you have to prove every few years that you have a disability to be eligible for welfare. So those are the ones that are ongoing. The problem with those, though, even those people get kicked off of unjustifiably. So one example, I used to work with people who had AIDS and were on disability for having AIDS. So they were receiving Social Security disability. And they couldn't work, but they also couldn't get a job because there was such discrimination. So there's a lot of factors that go into people who get benefits, who get welfare. And so with that, it's really interesting because the federal standard for being disabled doesn't keep up with the times. So nowadays, you don't get AIDS and die within 3 months, right? But the feds, in some aspects, think you do. So if you're still living and you haven't passed away, how can you still be disabled? So there's a lot of problems with receiving disabilities, even if you're justifiably disabled. So even though there's time limits, there's limits that happen not based on time, but just based on the feds failing to keep up with the times.
Yes.
I kind of want to elaborate on that as well. I don't know what as far as like welfare that you were referring to, but I'll just talk a little bit about unemployment insurance. When I first I was in the military, and so when I first got out of the Navy, I actually was a year on unemployment insurance, and this was back in 2012, and they were very lenient, and as long as you said every week, hey, these are the jobs that I'm applying to, you're good. But now they changed it, so now it's basically 6 months, 6 to 7 months, and I personally believe that there are people that have gone 2-3 years without a job, you know what I mean? So, it just varies, so.
Great. Sarah.
Hey, my question is actually a super personal level one, which is that I have a neighbor who's a friend. We live downtown in a building, and he rents. And about a block away, they've just built this beautiful new building called Atmosphere, which I understand to be low-income housing or something to that effect. And what he and I often have discussions about are, he works full-time, his wife works full-time, they pay daycare, blah, blah, blah. They pay rent in our building, which is certainly not as nice as the brand new Atmosphere building where people are getting subsidized housing. And so he's salty about that. And I would like to know what any of you might say to him in terms of the reasoning behind why it's important, that type of thing.
Well, I would like to say that it's all about perspective, but then again, not everybody's going to have a certain perspective. So I know there are situations there. A lot of people say, I pay my taxes and, this is not fair, blah, blah, blah. But I would just kind of educate him on, you say he's your friend. So I will kind of have a, intellectual conversation about the differences and how that subsidized housing can actually help people get out of that situation, because most people don't want to be in that situation. They want to get out of that situation. Obviously you have a few abusers here and there, and a lot of it is psychological, that they've been taught that, okay, as long as the government is giving me money or giving me subsidized housing, that it's all good. So you have a few of those, but for the most part, people don't want to be on that. That's just something to help them in the meantime until they find a better job or generate more income. So,
Other thoughts?
Well, so I'm very familiar with Atmosphere in particular. Wakeland's one of our members of the San Diego Housing Federation. And there are different populations. And so in that very building, in fact, you have folks who are some seniors, you have some permanent supportive housing, you have some transition-aged youth, which are people just out of the foster system who have some of the highest rates of homelessness of any population. I think only LGBT youth exceed that. So some of those populations are, in fact, people, when you talk about handout versus a hand up, there are people for whom this is a permanent handout. If you're a senior, past your working age, the best thing we can do is provide you a home where you can live there the rest of your life. It isn't a transition. And that's true of other folks in other circumstances. For families, the idea, of course, is that this is a stable platform where you can begin to amass savings, you can get your kids through school, and you can use it as a stepping stone to the next thing. Problem being that the next thing, if they move out of subsidized housing, the rent is likely to be double. It's not going to be an incremental increase. They make 5% over their income, and they're not eligible, they're looking at double the income. So a lot of this is being driven by a conversation from a place of scarcity, and there's a lot of discussion around that. If we make poor decisions under conditions of scarcity. Once upon a time, we used to take care of middle income with housing, and that is up until FHA was invented. Public housing was for the middle income folks, right? We then created consciously a system of FHA of getting people into mortgages, white people into mortgages in suburbs, and abandoned effectively the middle class and made public housing all about poor people. And it was easier to demonize, segregate, et cetera. So, that's not a simple answer for your friend, like why am I paying lots more rent for something not as nice, and those people are paying less for something nicer. There's a whole bunch to unpack there. And so we have to talk, I think.
We'll just invite you to dinner one night.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long conversation.
What other questions do you all have? I have plenty of questions to continue to go, but go for it.
Okay, I have a question about Prop 13. When we passed that, 1978, it was to keep grandma in her house. But then we started allowing grandma to take her benefit to other counties or to pass along the benefit to her children. And I'm just wondering why we aren't eliminating Prop 13, repealing Prop 13. Do you ever see that going away? Are there going to be that many individuals to continue benefiting forever? Or their heirs, not them.
I mean, I think that's a good question. I think from a, sort of pragmatic standpoint, it's been really, I mean, just in terms of the polling and, Prop 13 obviously was a proposition that went to the voters. So I think it's very hard to, certainly to get rid of the whole thing because there are a lot of people and people who are much more likely to vote who benefit from it. There.
Grandma votes.
But Grandma should be dead by now.
Yeah, and there is, I mean, like in terms of sort of, I think in terms of pushing back against sort of bad extensions as opposed to repealing, I mean, there are moves that I've heard of, and I haven't looked into closely, but to allow sort of portability of people up, down to age 55, to let them take their tax break and move to a different house. So I think like, I think like.
It just seems so unfair to the people living next door. If my grandchildren lived next door to your grandchildren who had that benefit, one family paying 4 times as much for the same services in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge inequity, and it's a problem in terms of being able to fund schools, and it's an inequity among homeowners, and then again, like I said, an inequity between homeowners and renters and corporate landowners. And I think, personally, I think like having a level playing field for folks and having a means-based test for low-income, fixed income folks, whether they're seniors or disabled, to make sure that they don't get charged so much property tax that they're required to that they get evicted essentially or foreclosed on. In the short term, I don't see the whole thing going away, and I think that looking at split rolls is a strategic decision around like where addressing the equity and also addressing the funding stream. So I think that's sort of the next step, and
I'm going to throw in a comment. What I'd like to do is join you and her friend for dinner, because I think there's a relationship to that question. I think I'm not that deep into the numbers. There are some inequities for Prop 13 on the property taxes, and those are real, and we understand that in the same way there's an inequity in housing. But I think it's really important when we think about this, we're diving into some details. Let's look at what's going on in this economy. We have banks, we have oil companies, and we have these large corporations. They're writing the rules, so they're exempt from taxes. I looked at the figure. This is $9 billion in state because of that we would get if we had split roll. And I think part of the, from a bigger picture perspective, part of the way that the Republicans won, Trump won, was to sort of have us fighting amongst ourselves for the relatively small inequities. And again, I don't want to minimize that, because these problems are real and these challenges are real. But I think when we look at this, I think our responsibility is to look at the oil companies that are polluting our environment, and it's well beyond oil companies. Look at the banks that have devastated our economy, and they've forced us into a situation where we're making difficult choices for ourselves, where if we could focus on the changes that we need, they're going to hold them accountable and hopefully have the impact to everyone. So that's just an added thought, which hopefully is helpful.
I'm going to actually train. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, go for it.
Hiding in the corner here. Hi, my name's Jerry. I am really surprised what is Parisa explained that San Diego is one of the 23 most segregated communities in America, is from what I understand, and that fits with what I've been observing over the last 28 years I've been here. But the thing that concerns me is that, and not to attack Indivisible at all, but I had been really criticizing Indivisible across the country for being so white. And it's obvious that this president and administration is actively working to suppress people of color, especially Black Americans. And it seems that we're missing a monstrous opportunity to stand aside people of color, especially in this community. We're in the middle of Mountain View and Valencia, and there's not a single Black person in the room. And this is economic justice, and they're the people that are being most economically impacted negatively. legally, the first thing Trump came after in the first week was legal aid. Why go after legal aid of all things? Why would you want to take away legal representation from poor people, especially people of color? So if we see that San Diego is, it was just a major revelation to hear about the Obama administration and our San Diego Housing Commission working actively against, out of 23 other areas in the country, we're the only ones that haven't decided to take on this program. And it fits, so and then we talk about housing. When you look at downtown in the last decade, we used to have 14,000 SROs. Now we're down to 4,500. I actually wrote the paper on that for a group. And downtown right now is 20% more white than the rest of the city, and the average income is about 73,000. So if you take in all these people at places like Atmosphere, and you look at the income that a lot of the people in the San Diego affordable housing community are making downtown, it actually is the income for the other side is probably a lot higher than 73,000. So there's an imbalance. So my concern is that we need to get more focused on the racial aspects of these things. It all ties together, and it all ties together where we're basically helping sustain a structurally racist San Diego County. And I'd personally like to work against that, and would like to work with groups that are aggressively working and focusing on that topic, as uncomfortable as may be.
Yeah. So let me just if I could just broaden that concern and question. Just what does organizing in today's world look like when it comes to pursuing economic justice, so that we're not fighting amongst one another, so that we're not segregated across racial, ethnic lines? What does that look like? And how does it happen in your minds?
I can only talk about my organizing experience. So one of the things that we do as the San Diego Housing Federation, we really represent anyone who is concerned with affordable housing in the region. We've been typified as being just a developers organization, but the truth is we have far more people working in human services in affordable housing than we do in development. So the daily contact with people is really important. And we realized years ago that an important resource we had were the actual residents of affordable housing who understood what it meant to actually have a stable life in that setting. And so we've been organizing internally and helping do leadership training with our residents so that they could go and be, for instance, we have a team that was just pounded on Brian Mainshine hard. I shouldn't say pounded on him. Worked with him to maintain a relationship, so when we needed a critical vote at the legislature, he was the only Republican vote to cross for Tony Atkins' bill. We were part of that. Our residents were part of turning this man's thinking, because he could now see directly and humanize. I mean, it was really about bringing it down from the grassroots up. And so that's what, for us, organizing means actually looking at the people who understand the system from within, who experience it, who are, our residents.
Other thoughts?
So I personally am doing several things about this topic that you were discussing. I understand that obviously we need to be side by side, but I believe, first of all, we need to understand our trauma and our dysfunctions per se. And so I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I actually do workshops on the psychology of African Americans. And so what I do is kind of break down the barriers. A lot of people don't understand, this is kind of going off rails, but a lot of people don't understand why they eat chitlins. Like, don't understand the cultural significance of it, and don't understand that, they great grandmother, that she didn't have a choice, that was the food that she was given. So they don't even understand the cultural aspects of that. They don't understand why there's a crabs in a barrel mentality. So before we can actually stand side by side, and that is a goal of mine, we need to understand to stand side by side with each other, because there's a lot of infighting, and there's a lot of people that have what we call a colonized mindset. So before we can even get to that, we need to clean our own closet, in a sense. And so once we can do that, and we can get people to actually, see that, hey, there's a problem. San Diego is segregated, and we need to bring everything together. And so that's why I'm so big on the tech and innovation space, because besides people that have generational wealth here in San Diego, that's going to be the next wave of people. Everyone knows, I don't know if everyone is aware, so I'm not going to assume, but San Diego for tech and innovation is one of the best places to actually start a business in and start a world. But a lot of, like I said, a lot of people of color are being turned away from that and it's not being accessible to them, so the information. And so in the next 5 to 10 years, that's going to be where all the money's going to come from, where the tech startups and, the millionaires and the billionaires. And so I want to get ahead of the wave on that before anything else. But yes, we need to clean our own closets.
Peter.
I think racial justice is a key element, and it's just like side by side with economic justice in this country. You really, they have different names, but there's just so much overlap. You really can't take them apart. And I think the concerns that were raised that sort of in terms of this question are important. And I also think so our model of organizing and working with folks, CPI, Center on Policy Initiatives, we do a lot of research, and then we also do advocacy work. And we don't have an organizing base. We don't go knock on doors. We don't organize folks in the workplace. But we work with community organizations that do that. We work with labor organizations that do that. And so I think our model of organizing is a coalition-based model, right? So we work with SEIU 221, we work with ACE, we work with San Diego Organizing Project, we work with a variety of different organizations. And I think, I think there's sort of two things there. One is, I think, it's great that you all are out here, and I think the question is how can we engage with folks? And it's great to sort of to think about and pay attention and be conscientious in our own organizations to make sure that we're not setting up barriers. And I think it's also important to work with people where they are in the organizations where they have leadership as well, in terms of speaking to communities of color. So I think that's important. And I think as an organization, I think you sort of build, you build power, and you build a sense that you're respectful and open to people of color by working respectfully in coalition with them if they're not a leadership part of your organization already. So that's what I would say. And I think it is important to I think there are so many different types of organizations that are organizing folks, from labor to various community, environmental, et cetera, organizations, that coalitions are critically important because there is such an overlap around all of those, environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice. There's a huge overlap, and so obviously the more we can work together, the stronger we are.
Do you?
Geez, where to begin? How are we organizing today? I think I appreciate a lot of the points that have been made. I think what is critical and exciting about this moment, and of course, Indivisible being at the forefront of it, where they're, certainly being part of the labor movement and working with community organizations and housing organizations. There sort of is what's his name? Gibbs says, the professional left. So these are paid staff that have worked for institutions that have done good work, and we've had a lot of wins and we've had a lot of losses over the years. And then all of a sudden, we have this energy created by the election of Trump, as exemplified by Indivisible and others. And to me, the challenge of our day is how do we, those of us within those institutions and those that, maybe for the first time we're active as Indivisible, how do we make sure that 2 + 2 = 7? And I think there's a lot of the points that have been made. So some of it, there's a real challenge. There's a real challenge within the labor movement and within sort of the nonprofit organizations to say, let's be a little bit flexible. Let's figure out how to work differently. Let's figure out how to, as has been mentioned, to extend ourselves further to be, where there are spaces that are disproportionately white, to be more open and collaborative with communities of color. And I'll just highlight concretely, I've done a lot of work with SAU with Flip the 49th, which has been working with Indivisible 49, the rallies at ICE's office. There's a bunch of new groups. We put together this monthly meeting, which is called the Action Council of all the groups active in the 49th are meeting. And then we started the political entity of that, which is Flip the 49th, which is a grassroots super PAC. Come volunteer and make sure that we flip the 49th at a door knocking time near you.
Canvas on
All right, great. So that's going to be exciting. And I think, to me, I mean, obviously there's always work to be done, but I think, frankly, there's pushback within the labor movement. Like, I'm not sure this is different than the way that we've done that. There's people that say, well, I'm not sure how this fits within my nonprofit, so people have to go and volunteers. But to me, the point is, before this election, I was called upon to do rallies at ICE's office, and I would be thrilled if I could get 10 people at that rally. And of course, now there's hundreds of people, and there's hundreds of people in motion. So to me, I think what's important is, like, we continue to be flexible. We continue to figure out how to work with folks that aren't usual suspects in a different way. We can continue to listen to each other and respect each other. And I think these are some of the principles that have, obviously, to me, like over the last year, the transformative organizing have been around the pushback for healthcare, the response in Florida after the shootings with those kids, and the Black Lives Matter movement over the last couple of years. And I think all those had these kind of organizing principles of collaboration across sectors to build more power and to sort of keep our eyes on the prize. So that's, I mean, there's so many more, but those are at least a couple initial thoughts on that.
So with the Obama era desegregation policy that should be implemented and isn't, I've tried really hard to get a lot of coalitions behind that and a lot of organizations behind that, and I have not been successful. So I'm an attorney on my own. I work during the day at a law school, and at night I do pro bono cases and this type of work. It's hard, and a lot of people don't want to discuss these issues. A lot of these issues are really complicated, and people don't have time. They're also volunteering their nights to work on these issues. So I would not undervalue your voices alone, going before city council and saying, hey, I've read about this, I heard about this, this is not right. The more of us that say that, the better. I mean, we have coalitions that go and one person speaks on behalf of the coalition, and that's excellent, that's the best model. But when we don't have that and there's an injustice, please don't hesitate to just go and have your voice be heard and say what you feel is right. They will listen to you. We have some great electeds right now. We have Georgette Gomez, who's very responsive, and she's on the committee, the Smart Growth and Land Use Committee that deals with these issues. Please, my clients would appreciate this. People that aren't there because they're working 3 jobs or they have disabilities, they would appreciate this. And we also have people running for office right now locally who we could really get behind. If we have a 6th Democrat on city council, we'll have a veto-proof majority. We can get rent control, we can get desegregation efforts, we can get Section 8 discrimination ordinance passed, which died at the state 2 years ago, but there's a new state bill just for veterans, which is awesome, but it should be for everyone. I encourage you. Brian Pease is here. He's running for City Council District 2. He's for rent control. He's talked about the desegregation efforts. There's a lot of good people that we can really help locally and just on our own too.
Great. Final thought, Luis.
So I wasn't gonna say this secret, but I'm gonna let you guys in on a little secret. So I know a lot of people, African Americans who've lived here in San Diego for years and years. Most of them are like 45 and over. They have a nickname. It's called the Mississippi of the West, and that's what they call San Diego. And so that goes to show you how far we have to go to solve that problem of segregation in San Diego. So
great. We've got a lot of work to do. Oh, Sarah, you got one? Okay. One last quick question before we wrap up.
And I know this could be a bigger question, so I'm looking for maybe just some quick things to look out for. I know a lot of you have mentioned access to quality education, equal access, and you've already mentioned some things that definitely affect that, things like segregation, affordable housing and where it is, making sure everyone, including corporations, are paying their share so we have something to fund public education. Are there any, and I know it has to be quick, are there any issues that we should be keeping an eye out for here locally that are preventing that equal access to education?
Perspective.
So So from where I sit, one of the big educational challenges is to have a workforce that can actually build the housing we need, and that's a crisis throughout the sector, is we need to triple the volume of production just to keep up with growth and actually start to make sure everyone can be housed. We need 3 times as many workers. We need to honor the trades in ways and teach that from a very early age so people don't have to think it's, you know, all college bound. There's really good paying jobs potentially if we can get folks. So I think we need to respect the full spectrum of labor, honor the trades, make sure people can make living wages in those sectors so that they will be drawn into them.
Thanks. There's a few things. So the first one is, you all remember in August when the current person in the presidency, he tried to dismantle the affirmative action work. So not dismantling affirmative action, but taking away kind of the mechanism to which we review and oversee and encourage and maintain the affirmative action in higher universities. That's a huge one. That's absolutely, you know, devastating for higher education. There's a bill right now pending called the Prosper Act. I encourage you all to Google it. And what it does is it limits the amount that you can take out for grad school to $23,500, which is devastating. That means if you're not the beneficiary of intergenerational wealth, which is generally white Caucasian individuals, then you are going to be less likely to be able to even access higher education. That same bill, the Prosper Act, also dismantles public service loan forgiveness, which a lot of us are on and benefit from. It means you go to school, your parents aren't paying, you're paying, you graduate with, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a teacher. 10 years in the public sector of helping, you know, communities that need your help, and your loans are forgiven. So you're paying loans all along, but the rest of your loans are forgiven at the end. That is going to be dismantled from the Prosper Act. So there's a lot that we can be doing and we can be advocating for right now. So those are 2 big things. The third big thing is, and this is a little bit more controversial, and I'm not an education law expert, but vouchers. So keep in mind the historical context behind vouchers. So after Brown versus Board of Education, vouchers were used in some states as a way to destroy the public education system. So they actually closed down public education, said they'd give everyone vouchers, and then allowed the schools accepting vouchers, created private schools to accept vouchers, and they were white-only schools. So it was a way to refuse to integrate. That's the basis under which vouchers were created. So just keep that in mind.
And I'll do a quick piggyback from that. It's sort of the same issue. The importance of charter school reform. There are real issues within public schools, and there are some charter schools that are good models, but there's also sort of within the charter school reform movement to move education from a public good to a for-profit entity, and that's a real problem. And so charter school accountability is to really separate those that are doing good models for teaching and supporting students to those that are trying to take education and make it a commodity. So that's a really important thing we need to continue to watch.
One more thought?
Yep.
Okay.
So I just want to speak. I mean, I think all of those are critically important. I think the other thing to keep in mind is the critical role that teachers and teachers unions play. I mean, we've seen these incredible strikes in West Virginia, you know, throughout in Arizona, just in Colorado, I believe, just this last week. You know, those are critically important. Teachers unions and public employees in general are under attack. I mean, there was this incredible article that I believe was in the New York Times about, you know, these various public employees, teachers and other public employees with, you know, second and third jobs. So you know, obviously, you know, we can sort of see that as a West Virginia problem or whatever, but you know, teachers unions are under attack in California as well.
Stand up, fight back.
So you know, like, I mean, there's a lot of the same people that are pushing the charter agenda are pushing the, like, you know, make it easier to fire teachers and undermine their unions agenda, and so we need to stand with our teachers and make sure that they have the resources that they need in the classroom and to support their families as well.
Great. So I have a
Fix
couple
education in 1 minute. What a terrible question.
Right. I have a couple of announcements, but before I make those announcements, let's give them a hand. So, building off some of the inspirational answers about getting involved, getting out there, working with other groups, flipping the 49th, among other things. I want to put out there 3 dates to keep an eye out for. May 1st, our voter guide is going to be published, so keep an eye out for that. And I want to thank Doug for leading the effort on that. May 12th, as Sarah said, we'll be canvassing in the 49th, so come out and join us. And also save the date for the June 2nd to 3rd weekend. We are combining forces with groups in San Diego to do a massive get out the vote effort for the primary. So come and join us for that. It's one of the ways that we'll be involved with a bunch of other organizations that are also doing good work. And it's obviously a really important time. So we're coming down the home stretch. This is the time to be active. We've had some wonderful panels over the past 3 months that have given us a lot of things to think about, to communicate about. And so now it's getting out and actually talking to people and communicating them and helping to influence things in this coming election.